Tom Hardy had spent years in the limelight, on red carpets, in front of cameras, embodying ruthless gangsters, battle-hardened warriors, and unbreakable men. But acting had always been a facade, a skin he wore for the world. Beneath it, there was something else, something real. That's why he left it all behind. The decision wasn't sudden. The industry had worn him down, the relentless schedules, the constant expectations, the superficiality. He craved something real. Something he could build with his own hands. So he did. A piece of land in northern Arizona, tucked away from the chaos of modern civilization. A ranch with a few hundred acres of untamed soil, a modest farmhouse, and a long stretch of dirt road leading to the main highway. No agents, no fans, no cameras. Just him, the land, and the work. Tom learned quickly. He wasn't the type to half-ass things. He studied soil conditions, irrigation, livestock care. Morning started before dawn, long before the sun painted the sky in red and gold. He repaired fences, fed cattle, tilled the earth. It was brutal work, but it made sense to him. There was no pretending here. Life on the farm wasn't easy, but it was his. A town wasn't far from his land, small, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The people were good folk, but there was a tension hanging over them. Tom noticed it at the diner, at the supply store. The cautious glances. The hushed conversations. The looks they gave him when they realized he was new. It didn't take long to find out why. The first time he heard the engines, they came like a storm. The roar of Harley-Davidsons echoing through the valley, a dozen or more riders rolling through town like they owned the place. The locals averted their eyes, shoulders tense, lips pressed shut. He asked about them. People didn't want to talk. The sheriff, a tired-looking man named Danvers, kept his answers vague. "They're just trouble, Hardy. Best keep to yourself." Tom didn't like that answer. It was a quiet afternoon when they came to his ranch. He was stacking hay when he heard the engines, a deep, guttural rumble that grew louder as they approached. He wiped sweat from his brow and turned, watching as 5 bikes rolled onto his property. The leader was easy to spot. A tall man, built like a brick wall, wearing a leather cut with a grinning skull on the back. His eyes were dark, predatory. He had the kind of presence that made weaker men nervous. Tom wasn't one of them. "Nice place you got here," the man said, stepping off his bike. His crew followed, spreading out casually, like they'd done this before. Tom said nothing, just met his gaze. The leader smirked. "See, around here, there's a fee. A little something to keep things smooth. A man in your position? You'd be wise to pay up." Tom let the silence stretch. Then, he exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Not happening." The smirk disappeared. The air got heavier. One of the bikers took a step forward, but the leader stopped him with a look. "That's the wrong answer." Tom wiped his hands on his jeans, then looked at the man. "Then ask me again." There was a beat. Then, the leader laughed, a short, amused chuckle. "I like you," he said. "You remind me of someone who thinks they can win." He nodded to his men. "Teach him what happens when you don't listen." The first punch came fast. Tom was ready. They expected him to fold. To get beaten down like the rest. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Tom moved like a man who had spent years training his body to be a weapon. The first attacker lunged, Tom sidestepped, catching him in the ribs with a brutal elbow. The man gasped, doubling over, and Tom finished him with a knee to the face. The second came at him with a wild swing. Tom ducked, driving his shoulder into the biker's chest, tackling him into the dirt. A fist connected with his jaw from the side. Pain exploded, but he absorbed it, pivoting into a brutal counter that sent another man sprawling. The leader watched, unimpressed. Then, he stepped in. Tom barely had time to react before a boot connected with his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered, trying to recover. But hands grabbed him, too many hands. He fought like hell, but numbers won in the end. A fist crashed into his skull, darkness swam at the edges of his vision. He hit the ground. The last thing he saw before the world faded was the leader crouching down next to him, shaking his head. Wrong answer, Hardy. Then, everything went black. Pain. That was the first thing Tom felt. A dull, throbbing ache pulsing through his ribs and jaw, his body stiff from being in one position for too long. His head was pounding, and the taste of blood lingered on his tongue. The second thing he felt was cold metal against his wrists. Cuffs. His eyes cracked open, adjusting to the dim light. A concrete floor. A metal chair. The air smelled like oil, sweat, and stale beer. A garage, maybe a warehouse. Tom tried to shift, testing the cuffs. They were tight, but not unbreakable. He was alive. That was a mistake they'd regret. Footsteps echoed. A door creaked open. The leader of the bikers, Tom hadn't caught his name yet, walked in, flanked by two of his men. He was carrying a bottle of whiskey, casual as ever, like this was just another day at the office. "Well, look who's awake," the man said, grinning. "Took you long enough." Tom stared at him, silent. He wasn't about to give this bastard the satisfaction of a reaction. The biker crouched in front of him. "You made quite the first impression, Hardy. Thought you were just some washed-up movie star playing cowboy. Turns out, you got some fight in you." He took a swig from the bottle, then offered it. "Drink?" Tom didn't move. The biker chuckled. "Suit yourself." He stood, pacing. "Here's the deal. This town, it runs on our rules. We let people live their little lives, run their little businesses, so long as they remember who's in charge." He turned back to Tom. "And you? You just spit in our face." Tom smirked, his voice dry. "You get that a lot?" The biker's grin flickered. A sharp backhand cracked across Tom's face, sending fresh pain through his jaw. He tasted more blood. The biker exhaled. "You don't seem to understand your situation, Hardy. You don't walk away from this. You don't go back to your farm and pretend none of this happened." He leaned in, voice low. "You either work for us, or you don't work at all." Tom held his gaze. "Go to hell." The biker's eyes darkened. "That's the wrong answer." Again. He turned to his men. "Lock him up. We'll deal with him later." They dragged him into a back room, a converted storage unit, cold and damp. A single light bulb buzzed overhead. The cuffs were swapped for a pair of rusted chains bolted to the wall. Then, they left him. Tom sat still, breathing through the pain, assessing. The cuffs were old. Weak. They'd underestimated him. For the next few hours, he worked on the chains, twisting, pulling, testing their weak points. His arms burned, his wrists bled, but he kept going. Then, he heard something. Voices. Outside the thin walls, the bikers were drinking, laughing. A fight broke out, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Distraction. Perfect. With one last pull, Tom felt the metal groan. He shifted his weight, using the leverage of his whole body, and with a final, brutal wrench. Snap. The chain broke free. His wrists were raw, his body screaming in protest, but he ignored it. He moved fast, keeping low, slipping to the door. Locked. Of course. Tom scanned the room. Tools. A rusted metal rod in the corner. He grabbed it, wedged it into the door's latch, and pried. The old wood creaked, then cracked open. He was out. The hallway was empty. A dull hum of conversation came from a larger room nearby. Tom moved like a shadow, barefoot on concrete, muscles tensed. He needed a weapon. The first biker he found was passed out drunk on a ratty couch, a knife strapped to his belt. Tom took it. Then, he kept moving. Through the garage. Past rows of bikes. He spotted the exit, a heavy metal door leading outside. Freedom was close. But then. Footsteps. Tom pressed himself into the darkness as two bikers walked past, talking low. "Boss says we handle Hardy tomorrow. Make an example of him. Guy's tougher than he looks. He'll be a pain in the ass if he gets loose." The second man scoffed. "Cuffed to a wall. Where's he gonna go?" Tom smirked. They turned the corner. He moved. Out the door. Into the night. The cool air hit his skin, fresh and sharp. The compound was in the middle of nowhere, dirt roads, scattered trees, distant hills. He didn't have much time before they noticed he was gone. His farm was miles away. No car, no shoes, no backup. But that didn't matter. Because now, he had a plan. And he was going to make them pay. Tom ran through the night, his body a symphony of pain, but his mind was sharp, focused. The biker compound was behind him, its dim lights fading into the distance. His breath was steady, his pace relentless. His farm was at least 15 miles away. A long, brutal trek on foot. He didn't care. Survival mode had kicked in. The desert night was cold, the ground uneven, rocks biting into his bare feet. He pushed forward. Pain was just information. Nothing more. His body screamed, but he didn't listen. The only thing that mattered was getting home. And getting ready. Dawn was breaking when he reached the edge of his land. His farmhouse stood like a beacon of familiarity, its wooden frame bathed in the soft glow of morning light. The cattle in the pasture grazed lazily, unaware of what was coming. Tom staggered to the front porch, his muscles locking up from exhaustion. He pushed open the door, grabbed a bottle of water from the kitchen, and downed half of it before slumping into a chair. He wasn't safe yet. The bikers would come. He knew that much. When they realized he was gone, they'd want to finish what they started. But they wouldn't be expecting what was coming. He was done playing defense. Tom took stock of everything he had. His tool shed was packed with supplies, some nails, a hammer, an old chainsaw, and barbed wire. His gun locker held a .308 hunting rifle, a 12-gauge shotgun, and a Glock 19 with a few spare mags. It wasn't much. But it would do. First, he reinforced the house. He boarded up weaker windows, set up makeshift barricades at the front and back doors, and ran barbed wire along the fence line. Then, he set traps. He dug small trenches along the main entrance, covered them with dirt and dry grass. Anyone who came charging in would regret it. Next, he checked his weapons. Cleaned them. Loaded them. Finally, he stood in the middle of his property, taking it all in. This was his land. And he'd die before he let them take it from him. He needed more ammo. And information. The local gun store was run by a man named Virgil, an old-timer who had seen his fair share of trouble. Tom walked in, trying to hide the limp in his step. Virgil looked up from behind the counter, eyes narrowing. "Jesus, Hardy. You look like hell." Tom smirked. "Feel worse." Virgil leaned in, voice low. "I heard about what happened. Word spreads fast. Those bastards at the Black Canyon Riders, they don't take kindly to losing." "I need ammo," Tom said. "And anything else you can spare." Virgil hesitated, then nodded. "I've got a few things in the back." "You planning something?" Tom's jaw tightened. "Yeah." Virgil sighed. "Just be careful, son. They run this town. The sheriff won't help you." "I'm not asking him to." As Tom loaded up his truck with supplies, he felt it, the quiet before the storm. The bikers weren't done with him. They'd come soon. And this time, he'd be ready. The sun dipped low over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in streaks of deep red and burnt orange. Tom stood on his porch, his rifle resting against his shoulder, scanning the horizon. The land was quiet. Too quiet. They were coming. He could feel it in his bones. The distant rumble of engines shattered the silence. Tom's grip tightened on the rifle. The dust cloud rising on the road meant one thing: the Black Canyon Riders were here. They came in a swarm, a dozen bikes roaring down the dirt path toward his ranch. Headlights cut through the dusk. The lead rider, the bastard who had knocked Tom out days ago, rode front and center. His face was hidden behind a skull-pattern bandana, but Tom knew that look. Pure, unfiltered confidence. They thought this would be easy. They were wrong. Tom didn't wait. As the bikers charged onto his land, their tires hit the hidden trenches. The first two riders went down hard, their bikes flipping, bodies slamming into the dirt. Chaos erupted. The rest swerved, trying to avoid the traps, but it was too late. Tom took his first shot. The rifle kicked against his shoulder as the .308 round found its mark. One biker fell from his ride, clutching his leg. The others opened fire. Gunshots ripped through the air, bullets slamming into the farmhouse walls. Tom ducked, moving fast, using the porch as cover. He fired again, another man down. The bikers were pinned for a moment, caught off guard by the resistance. Then, they regrouped. They ditched their bikes and advanced on foot, using cover, moving smart. These weren't just petty criminals, they knew how to fight. Tom grabbed the shotgun and braced himself. The first one reached the porch. Tom stepped out, firing point blank. The man crumpled. Another rushed in. Tom swung the stock of his shotgun like a sledgehammer, sending the attacker crashing through the railing. More were coming. They forced their way inside. Bullets ripped through the walls, shattering glass and kicking up splinters. Tom moved fast, using his knowledge of the house. He took out another intruder near the kitchen, then retreated upstairs. They followed. A shadow appeared at the top of the staircase. Tom lunged, grabbing the attacker and slamming him into the banister. The wooden railing cracked, and the man went over the edge, landing hard. But then, pain exploded in Tom's side. A knife. One of them had gotten close. Tom growled through clenched teeth, grabbing the man's wrist before the blade could twist. He slammed his forehead into the biker's nose, then drove an elbow into his throat. The man gasped, staggered back. Tom finished him with a brutal kick to the gut, sending him crashing down the stairs. Blood dripped down Tom's side, but he ignored it. The house was a war zone. Smoke filled the air. Bodies lay scattered. Then, silence. Were they retreating? No. The leader was still out there. And this wasn't over. Tom stepped outside, gun raised. The last of the bikers were either dead or crawling away in agony. But the leader stood there, unfazed. He clapped slowly, mocking. "Damn, Hardy. You really are something." Tom leveled the shotgun at him. "Last chance. Walk away." The leader grinned. "You think this is done? You think killing a few of my boys changes anything?" He took a step forward. "You don't get it. We own this town." Tom's finger tightened on the trigger. Then, something cracked against his skull from behind. A sledgehammer of pain. The world spun. Darkness swallowed him whole. Pain greeted Tom before his eyes even opened. A deep, pulsing agony radiated from the back of his skull, throbbing in rhythm with his heartbeat. His mouth was dry, his body stiff. He was alive, but just barely. His vision swam as he forced his eyes open. Chains. Again. His wrists were shackled to an overhead beam, forcing him to stand. His feet barely touched the ground. The air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and burnt rubber. A warehouse. He wasn't alone. A slow clap echoed through the space. The leader of the Black Canyon Riders stepped forward, his boots clicking against the concrete. Welcome back, Hardy, he said, smirking. Got a real knack for getting yourself caught, huh? Tom said nothing. His mind was already working, scanning, assessing. His hands were bound, but his legs were free. That was something. The leader circled him like a predator. I'll admit, you put up a hell of a fight. He gestured around the room. Lost some good men tonight. And that pisses me off. Tom exhaled through his nose. Then come finish it. The leader chuckled. Oh, we're gonna finish it, all right. But not quick. See, I want you to understand something before you die. He leaned in close. This is my town. My rules. You could have played along. Could have kept your little farm. But you had to be a hero. Tom locked eyes with him. I don't play by your rules. The leader's grin faltered. Then, a fist crashed into Tom's ribs. He grunted, absorbing the pain, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. Another punch followed, then another. His vision blurred. Blood dripped from his mouth. Still, he didn't break. The leader stepped back, shaking his head. Damn, you're stubborn. He turned to one of his men. Go get the blowtorch. The biker nodded and disappeared. Tom exhaled, flexing his fingers. His wrists were raw, the chains cutting into his skin. But he had felt it, the beam above him was old, weak. A few more good swings. Now or never. As the biker returned with the torch, Tom shifted his weight. He swung his legs up, wrapping them around the chain. With a grunt, he yanked, using every ounce of strength left in his body. The rusted metal groaned. The leader's eyes widened. What the? Snap. The beam gave way. Tom dropped to the ground, his hands still bound but free from the ceiling. He didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, shoulder-checking the closest biker. The man stumbled, and Tom stole his knife in a blur of motion. One quick slice, his hands were free. The room exploded into chaos. The biker with the blowtorch swung, but Tom ducked, driving the knife into his gut. A scream filled the air as the man dropped. The leader cursed, reaching for his gun. Tom was faster. He grabbed a wrench off a nearby workbench and threw it. The heavy metal struck the leader's hand, sending the gun clattering across the floor. No more weapons. Just fists. The leader roared, charging like a bull. Tom sidestepped, landing a brutal punch to the ribs. The biker barely flinched. They crashed into each other, fists flying. The leader fought like an animal, wild, brutal, no finesse. Tom fought like a man who had spent years training. Calculated. Deadly. A hook to the jaw. A knee to the ribs. Tom absorbed the blows, countering with precise strikes. But the leader was strong. A wild punch connected, sending Tom sprawling. His vision blurred. He tasted blood. The leader stood over him, panting. That all you got, Hollywood? Tom smirked. Then he grabbed a chain off the ground and swung. The metal wrapped around the leader's throat. Tom twisted, using every ounce of strength left in his body. The biker thrashed, gasping, clawing at the chain. Tom didn't let go. The leader's movements slowed. Then, he collapsed. Tom released the chain, breathing heavily. It was over. Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance. Tom leaned against a workbench, watching as the sheriff and his deputies stormed the warehouse. Danvers, the sheriff, stepped inside, his eyes widening at the carnage. Tom wiped the blood from his lip. Took you long enough. Danvers sighed. Jesus, Hardy. What the hell happened here? Tom exhaled. Cleaning up your mess. The sheriff looked at the battered, unconscious leader of the gang, then at the bodies littering the floor. He nodded. Guess you did. Days passed. The Black Canyon Riders were done. Those who weren't dead were in jail, their grip on the town shattered. Tom returned to his farm, his body aching but his spirit steady. He rebuilt. He worked the land. And for the first time in a long time, the valley was quiet. No more threats. No more violence. Just peace. And as the sun set over his land, Tom Hardy stood on his porch, a quiet smile on his lips. He had won. The dust had settled. The town was quiet. The war was over. But for Tom Hardy, the battle scars lingered. His body ached from the fight, deep bruises marking his ribs and arms, a cut on his cheek slowly healing. The sheriff had cleaned up the mess, arresting the remnants of the Black Canyon Riders, hauling their wounded leader off to face justice. Tom didn't care about any of that. He cared about his land. His home. And now, he had to rebuild. The farm had taken a beating. Bullet holes riddled the walls of his house. The front porch railing had been shattered in the firefight. His cattle had scattered during the chaos, and some of his fences were torn down. But Tom wasn't the type to wallow in defeat. He grabbed his tools and got to work. Each nail he drove into the wood, each plank he replaced, felt like a piece of himself was healing. The land had become more than just a refuge, it was a part of him now. He worked from sunrise to sunset, sweat dripping, hands covered in dirt. It was exhausting, but it was real. And he wasn't alone. Word spread fast in a place like this. At first, the townsfolk were cautious, still shaken from years of fear under the gang's rule. But then, they saw what Tom had done. They saw who he was. The first to show up was Virgil, the old gun shop owner. He brought lumber and a case of beer. Figured you could use a hand, he grumbled. Then came Mary, the diner owner, with fresh baked bread and stew. One by one, more people came. The hardware store owner donated supplies. A few ranchers helped repair his fences. Even Sheriff Danvers stopped by, though he mostly just leaned against his car, watching. Tom wasn't used to this, people caring. For years, he had played the lone wolf, the tough guy, the man who never needed help. But here, people stood by each other. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself accept that. A week after the battle, Danvers pulled up to the farm. Tom was stacking hay when he heard the crunch of tires. He turned, wiping sweat from his brow, as the sheriff climbed out of his patrol car. Danvers studied the land, nodding in approval. "Looks like you're putting things back together." Tom nodded. "No other choice." Danvers sighed. "Town's different now. Safer. Folks ain't looking over their shoulders anymore." He paused, then met Tom's gaze. "That's because of you." Tom didn't say anything. He just nodded. The sheriff pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with a slow breath. "You staying?" Tom leaned against the fence, looking out over the land. The rolling hills, the golden sunset, the quiet peace. "I think so." Danvers smirked. "Good. We could use a man like you around here." Then, he flicked his cigarette, climbed back in his car, and drove off. That night, Tom sat on his porch, watching the stars. The land was his now, not just something he had bought, but something he had earned. He had fought for it. Bled for it. And no one would ever take it from him again. For the first time in a long time, Tom Hardy felt at peace. The past was behind him. The future was his to build. And as the wind rolled through the valley, carrying the scent of fresh soil and open fields, he knew. This was home. The dust had long settled, and the ghosts of war had faded into the past. The valley, once gripped by the iron fist of the Black Canyon Riders, had changed. The air was lighter. The people walked a little taller. And at the heart of it all, Tom Hardy had found something he never thought he'd have, a second chance. Morning came early on the ranch. It always did. Tom stood in the middle of his land, hands on his hips, surveying the work ahead. The farm had taken a hit during the battle, but it was still standing, just like him. His house had been patched up, the bullet holes sealed, the broken porch railing replaced. The barn, once charred by fire, had been rebuilt stronger than before. The real work, though, was in the fields. His cattle had been spooked, scattered across the property when the gunfire rang out. Some had gone missing, but most had returned. His crops, already struggling in the dry Arizona heat, needed attention. It was a hell of a lot of work. But Tom wasn't afraid of that. He wasn't alone anymore. A truck rumbled up the dirt road toward the farm. Tom turned, squinting against the early morning sun as the vehicle came to a stop. The door swung open, and a familiar voice called out. "You planning to do all this by yourself?" Virgil, the gruff old gun shop owner, stepped out, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a sack of feed over his shoulder. Tom smirked. "Didn't know you did farm work." Virgil scoffed. "I don't. But a man can learn." Behind him, more cars pulled up. Ranchers. Townsfolk. People Tom had barely spoken to before. They came carrying tools, supplies, even a few heads of cattle to help replenish what he'd lost. The town hadn't forgotten what Tom had done. And now, they were here to return the favor. It felt strange. For so many years, Tom had lived like an outsider. A fighter. A man who took on the world alone. But now, standing on this land, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with him, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. Weeks passed, and the farm began to thrive. Tom's cattle were healthy, his fields finally yielding crops that could sustain him. The ranch, once a battle-scarred piece of land, had transformed into something else, a home. People from town started stopping by. Some came to help, others just to talk. The ranch had become a meeting place, a place where folks felt safe. And with safety came prosperity. Local businesses, once scared to expand under the rule of the bikers, began to grow. The supply store stocked more goods. The diner got busier. The sheriff even seemed less tired. Tom could feel it, the valley was healing. And so was he. But the biggest change was yet to come. Tom stood at the edge of his land, watching as a familiar car drove up the long dirt road. His heart pounded, not from fear, not from adrenaline, but from something else. Hope. The car came to a stop, and the door opened. A woman stepped out. Charlotte. Tom's wife. She had left when he did, when the Hollywood lights had become too much, when the life of cameras and premieres had driven a wedge between them. He had told her he needed time. She had told him she couldn't wait forever. But she was here now. And in the back seat, peeking out with wide, curious eyes, was their son. James. Tom swallowed hard. He had fought battles. Faced death. Stared down men who wanted him dead. But this moment? This was the hardest thing he had ever done. Charlotte stepped forward, her eyes searching his. "So," she said softly, "is this where you've been?" Tom nodded. "This is home now." She looked around, the fields, the house, the barn. Then she looked back at him. And smiled. The golden hues of the Arizona sunset bathed the ranch in a warm glow, the sky a vast canvas of orange and violet. The cool desert breeze rustled through the fields, carrying the scent of fresh soil and wild sage. For the first time in a long time, Tom Hardy felt at peace. But peace wasn't something he had ever been good at. It was something he had to learn. Dinner was quiet. Not awkward, but filled with unspoken words. Tom sat across the table from Charlotte, their son James between them, poking at his mashed potatoes. He had imagined this moment so many times, seeing them again, making things right. But now that they were here, the weight of everything unsaid pressed down on him. Charlotte finally broke the silence. "You really built all this?" She gestured around the cozy farmhouse. Tom nodded. "Didn't know if I could. But I figured it out." She smiled, tracing the edge of her glass. "Never thought I'd see you settle down." Tom smirked. Didn't think I could. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, the walls between them began to crumble. James, completely oblivious to the tension, spoke up. Mom says you used to be in movies. Tom chuckled. Yeah, a long time ago. James tilted his head. Why'd you stop? Tom thought about that for a moment. He could have given 1,000 answers: fame, exhaustion, the emptiness of it all. But instead, he just said, because I wanted something real. James seemed satisfied with that answer, going back to his food. Charlotte wasn't looking at her plate anymore. She was looking at Tom. And for the first time in years, there was something in her eyes that he thought he'd never see again. Maybe they had a chance. Days turned into weeks. Tom taught James how to ride a horse, how to mend a fence, how to wake up before dawn and put in a real day's work. At first, the boy hated it, groaning about the early mornings, dragging his feet. But then something shifted. One morning, Tom woke up to find James already outside, feeding the horses. Figured I'd start early, James said with a grin. Tom ruffled his hair. Atta boy. Charlotte, too, had found her place on the ranch. She had always loved gardening, and now she had an entire farm to tend to. The barren patches of land around the house soon became vibrant, filled with wildflowers, vegetables, and herbs. Tom would catch her smiling sometimes, kneeling in the dirt, hands covered in soil, completely in her element. She was happy. And for the first time, so was he. The town, once afraid, had started to thrive again. People were rebuilding, growing their businesses, living without fear. Tom became a part of that, helping when he could, keeping an eye on things. He wasn't a sheriff. He wasn't a hero. But people looked to him now. One evening, Virgil sat with Tom on the porch, a beer in hand. You ever think about leaving again? Tom took a long sip, watching the sunset. Not anymore. Virgil smirked. Good. You belong here. And for the first time in his life, Tom believed it. Tom stood at the edge of his land, Charlotte beside him, James playing with the dogs near the barn. The valley stretched out before them, endless and untamed. Charlotte slid her hand into his. You did it, she whispered. Tom glanced at her. Did what? She smiled. Found what you were looking for. Tom exhaled slowly, feeling the warmth of her fingers in his, the solid ground beneath his boots, the distant laughter of his son. For years, he had fought, on screen, in real life, against enemies, against himself. But now? Now, he was home. And for the first time, he wasn't looking for the next fight. He was looking at the future. His future. And it had never looked better.